I think this is one of the more interesting questions we've ever gotten. How would you letter/write a character with something like Tourette's? I tick, and I have no idea how I'd write that out in a comic. I love that you want to bring your own experiences into a comic. So let's see what we can do for you. Since you asked about tics on one of our lettering videos, I'm going to assume you're asking about vocal tics. The first method I tried is just with basic white speech bubbles. Since the tics don't have tails on each bubble, they feel disconnected from the other speech, but they're still layered on top, implying that they're originating from the same person. If you have variations in how you tick, or if certain tics are more intense or louder than others, you can use the classic method of larger type and a strained or shaky outline to represent shouting. And if your tics aren't actual words or sounds from the actual vocal cords, you could try removing the bubble to represent something like a tongue click. Now, I don't have Tourette's, and I don't fully understand how it feels to tick. But you could also try styling the tics to be more distinct than your other dialogue. This makes them feel more abrupt and maybe more involuntary. Proceed with caution though, because this starts to blend into the methods that comic creators use for showing possession, which, given the history of Tourette's, could feel regressive or misinformed if not handled carefully. On our video about lettering for Tourette's, a lot of people were confused by this floating bubble design to represent tics. Wouldn't it make more sense to put the vocal tics as inline text inside the speech balloons? This is, after all, how people with vocal tics sound to us, right? Well, why not both? Remember that comics are a series of panels, not just a single moment. And what if we could cut between two worlds, so to speak? The internally facing panels are from the perspective of someone with Tourette's. Here, there's a clear visual distinction between what they intend to say versus the tics. Then we could immediately cut to the external world, where they're surrounded by people, and the inline, more straightforward lettering represents how they sound to others. And it can get even more sophisticated. If you start to layer the ticking bubbles more aggressively, you begin to feel overwhelmed by them, confused about the order of the words, or even what is speech and what are thoughts. But then when we cut to the external world, all of that struggle is simplified. The other characters have no idea what is going on in the speaker's head. Now imagine if we style the internal tics to be more sinister, and then represent the growing urge to tick by increasing the size of each tick bubble as we go down the sequence. We can even add more haze than actually appear in the external speech, indicating that the speaker is managing to actually suppress some of the tics. Or we could even use the invasive building urge to tick in an internally focused panel, then cut to the speaker managing to speak with absolutely no tics. From the outside, the other characters have no idea what a struggle it must be to suppress so many tics just to order lunch. This is what I call a dimensional lettering system, because it allows you to dimensionalize an experience and play with perception to create empathy in the reader. Let's talk about the gray void problem in comic lettering. What is the gray void problem? Well, it's a problem that I accidentally created by creating lettering tutorials on a gray void, like this one you're watching now. I originally formatted my lettering tutorials this way because I wanted to force viewers to focus on the most overlooked part of comics, the pure graphic design of balloons and letter forms. The problem is, as our channel has grown, millions of people watch our content and are now too focused on nothing but lettering. The gray void has made them forget all that art and storytelling and context that normally accompanies lettering in a real comic. So now we might get a question like, how would I do lettering for someone who has crashed on a planet of blind aliens that use a special tapping language? And I need to translate the tapping for the reader, but I also need to indicate that the person hasn't fully learned the alien tapping language. And I might show something basic, like a white bubble with some missing words. And then people in the comments will say, well, this is confusing. I wouldn't fully understand the intention of this. And I think to myself, we actually made a comic like this, and there were multiple pages establishing the story and the characters, and there was additional hand-drawn sound effects and close-ups of hands, and if you just read this comic without overthinking it, you completely understand the intention. So just remember, when you watch our lettering content, imagine that gray void is full of all kinds of art and panels that come before and after that help tell the story. I promise that you'll get even more out of our videos. A very speedy person asked, how would you do lettering for someone slowed down, or from the perspective of someone going fast hearing someone? Ah, I see that once again thou hath not read from the holy text. In Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin's speed during a sugar rush is depicted by stepping out a single line of dialogue across multiple panels, using the same theories on perceived time that Scott McCloud discusses in Understanding Comics. Now, if you don't want your lettering as just floating type, you can enclose the extended sentence in balloons. I tried this a couple ways, stringing together standard round balloons and then combining them into a single shape that crosses over panel gutters. Or you can even stylize this further by snaking your lettering across a series of curves and rotating the balloons to match the curvature of the lettering. This is a little more fluid and might be the choice if you have a more cartoonish or looser art style. So there you have it, 3 ways to style lettering, but the lettering itself doesn't matter nearly as much as the basic principles of using paneling to depict the rate that time is passing. Here's a question I'm really excited to answer. Do you have any tips for showing stuttering or pausing in stressful or heated conversations? I feel like the usual ellipses and dashes look a little corny in some contexts. I have thought about this a lot when formatting the lettering in our comics, and here's what I've figured out. Dashes and ellipses are definitely born from prose, that is, blocks of text where there's no additional visuals or design elements to create space. But to me, having punctuation crammed onto the same lines as the dialogue does feel congested. I find that it helps to add more line breaks, which also starts to feel more emotionally correct. When you're upset, it doesn't feel like all your thoughts fit neatly together. It feels like your brain is starting again and again as you try and get a word out. But comics are a much more spacious medium than prose, so we can open up the layout even more and put each stutter in its own balloon. We can even put an ellipsis by itself in a balloon, using it more as a visual design element that might even represent a sound in the throat, like a word catching before you manage to get it out. Now that we've broken out the dialogue across balloons, we can just delete the em dashes. And we can even borrow from classic Calvin and Hobbes and replace the ellipsis with a squiggly line, which feels like an under-the-breath grumble or a visual representation of a brain hiccup. If you're interested in seeing this kind of lettering in action, I use some of these techniques in our comic series Interdimensional, which we self-publish and is available in both print and digital. Not sure exactly how to tackle this question. If you were lettering a character like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, how would you letter the difference between his 2 split identities, Smeagol and Gollum? P.S. You guys make great stuff and are a huge inspiration to me. Actually, you know what? Speaking of double, there's 2 ways to answer your question, and I'll show you both. And then you'll see why so much of comic lettering is personal style versus hard and fast rules. The first thing a lot of people might think of is to create 2 different looks for 2 different character balloons, then have both emerging from the same character. I basically did this in our own comic, Interdimensional 3, where this character looks like one character but actually has a sentient demon deer skull that speaks from on top of her head. The strength of this system is that once you establish it, the reader will know which voice is speaking, even if the character is off camera. But you actually referenced Gollum, and Peter Jackson has given us an incredible solution in the form of framing. When Gollum speaks, the camera frames him from one angle, but when Smeagol speaks, we cut to a different angle and facial expression. You can do this exact thing in comics if you just draw the 2 framings as panels and cut between them. In theory, with this technique, you could letter each identity with the exact same word balloon style, because the art and paneling is doing most of the heavy lifting. Just when you think you've answered every possible lettering question, how would you show a radio rapidly switching channels to synthesize a sentence? Ugh, you're gonna make me reference Michael Bay, aren't you? You might remember that in the Transformers movies, Bumblebee speaks using clips from his car radio.
XM satellite radio. Digital cable brings you
broadcasting system. So you talk through the radio?
But he uses entire phrases and sentences, and you've asked about rapidly switching, so I'd like to do it a little bit more chaotically. Let's take a simple sentence, then give each word or pair of words a unique font to represent things like pop song lyrics, formal news broadcasts, a booming announcer voice, or just regular talk radio voices. I want to make the type as different as possible, so it's clear we're rapidly switching genres across stations. And I'll continue stylizing them with different colors, balloon styles, gradients, or even tilting the type away from the rest. Now here you could overlap them so it feels like we're changing so rapidly that the words are almost stepping on each other. But we could also create a sequence of balloons and chain them with classic bolt-shaped connectors, which are often used to give the feel of an electronic transmission. On our last video about a radio switching channels, a few people suggested adding some extra words or onomatopoeias like kzzzt between each clip. I loved this idea, so the first thing I did was use one of my go-to sound effect fonts, Picos FX, which is available on Blambot and works for almost any situation. Simple, clear, a little cartoony in a charming way, and doesn't draw too much attention to itself. But I also wanted to try something with even more character, so I took a really basic, blocky typeface and actually started cutting it and shifting it like the kind of horizontal tearing you see in glitchy video or broadcast TV with poor reception. I really like the look of this, and I also love that it calls upon a widely known visual effect to trick our brain into hearing a specific type of sound. From here, I messed around with an actual photo of video static, trying to make it work as a pattern inside the letter forms. And while it looks amazing up close, it starts to get finicky and busy at smaller sizes. This is a great example of why I usually discourage people from using photographic effects in comic lettering. I'd probably just go with this earlier version. I think I finally figured out how to answer a question that we get a lot. What about a character that talks in Morse code? Now, a lot of you are watching saying, he finally figured out how to put dots and dashes inside a word balloon? I thought this guy was supposed to be smart at comic lettering. Well, if you start to translate a sentence into dots and dashes, you realize that some words end up being much longer than others. Even if you really try and shorten the shape of the dashes, you can still struggle to fit a single sentence into a word balloon. Luckily, I discovered that the written form of Morse code uses slashes between words for clarity, which then means you can modify the layout of a sentence to be much more symmetrical, putting a line break in the middle of words if you need to. But the real problem is that very few people actually know Morse code, so unless you want your character's dialogue to be an Easter egg, we need to figure out how to actually translate this for the reader. Comics often indicate translated dialogue with angle brackets. Unfortunately, in this case, we've now lost the unique charm of Morse code entirely. So the first thing I thought was just to put the dots and dashes next to whoever is talking, with a floating bubble nearby containing the translation for the reader. But in practice, when you actually put dots and dashes over line art, it gets incredibly busy, no matter how much you try and style it. I tried giving the Morse code its own balloon, but that just gets weirder, because it could look like the character is speaking twice, or another voice is responding to them, when it's supposed to be just one single piece of dialogue. Ultimately, I landed on a pretty interesting solution, which was a square box where the real Morse code sentence runs around the border as decorative flair, with the translated sentence inside. What's fun about this system is that you can still style the balloon and dialogue with different fonts to give it extra character, such as an intentionally robotic tail and typeface, or a vintage style for a steampunk-style automaton built by a mad Union Army engineer. You had a ton of different ideas on how to redo the Morse code balloon, so I tried a bunch of them. The first thing that hundreds of people suggested was graying out the Morse code and putting the English translation over top, or vice versa. For what it's worth, this is super smart and works great if you publish digitally for screens on a platform like Webtoon. But we print our comics, and if you've ever done low print run indie comics, you quickly realize how inconsistent certain things like gray tones can be. Even if you set up your file properly and get several rounds of proofs, you can get batches of a run where a gray prints too dark and makes it hard to read, or prints too light and you lose the gray. Also, we're unique in that Lydia letters some of our work by hand, and I love the challenge of trying to think of lettering solutions that she could do with a dip pen and Black India ink right out of the bottle. You also suggested placing the lines of Morse code either above or below the English text. In practice, because of the variable length of Morse code, you might have to space the words pretty far apart. This actually can be really effective in simulating the slow, halting nature of receiving a full message in Morse code, but it does make the balloon significantly larger. And as some of you wisely pointed out, this is only a 4-word sentence. What about even longer sentences? More like the real dialogue in our comics. I wrote something more like what you'd encounter in a real dramatic scene, and it fits in the same balloon as the stepped-out 4-word Morse code sentence. So you can only imagine how insane the size of this balloon would be, but you don't have to imagine, because I actually took the time to lay out the entire thing in Morse code, which was surprisingly annoying, and then spaced it all out in a round layout so I could see how big the balloon actually got. You can see how much more panel art it covers than a regular balloon, and I can't even imagine using this on a 5 or 6 panel page. Oh, and some people suggested using one of these fonts that helps you learn Morse code, or actually build my own font out of dots and dashes. Both of which I thought were actually really interesting, but both of them turned out to be their own nightmare of legibility. An E is technically only one dot, so you basically have to invent a new design system that stops looking like Morse code and could be mistaken for Braille. At this point, I was so sick of trying clever design solutions that I tried what some very clever commenters suggested, which is the R2-D2 or Groot method, where you just keep the Morse code and write the other character's dialogue in a way that helps explain what they said. And after trying almost every possible solution, if I had to make a comic with a Morse code speaking character, if I weren't intentionally limiting their dialogue to extremely short sentences, this is what I would do. The dots and dashes are clear and fun to read if you actually know Morse code, but there's no finicky design or sizing issues with the balloon, and it kind of forces you to write charmingly expository dialogue that is almost self-aware in how much work it's doing for the reader. Out of the millions of people who watched our videos on Morse code comic lettering, only one person brought this up. Do you even need to show it's Morse code in the lettering? Can't you just have a bubble with text formatted similar to a telegram receipt? Rectangular bubble stylized like typewriting if possible? Now you're talking my language. I'm surprised I didn't think of this, because you're right, a telegram is technically a visualization of Morse code, albeit in a very roundabout way. But I'm a huge fan of movies and books from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, so this is totally in my wheelhouse. Honestly, I think using a telegram-styled word balloon isn't really about showing Morse code, but it is incredible if you're trying to communicate a character with an over-the-top, retro-style transatlantic accent.
Maybe it was yesterday, Hildy. Been seeing me in your dreams?
I want to do this telegram lettering similar to how I did the elaborate contract in our business vampire video. And if you haven't seen that, it goes into much more detail on the process of creating comic lettering. But I love these old Western Union telegrams, especially the off-white paper and distinctive header. In fact, I think we could approximate the Western Union font to actually put our character's name at the top of each dialog box. So I'll use a serif font and give it some extra decorations. From what I can tell, these old telegrams were teletype, printed on strips of something called gum paper. So you could cut and paste the message line by line. The result is a teletype font sitting on light-colored strips. It's a really classic look that also provides a practical solution for a problem I've talked about before, which is the risk of your comic coming back darker than expected from the printer. These light bars help ensure legibility, separating the actual dialogue from the shading and detailing in the actual dialogue box. Telegrams also had these numbers added at the top of each message, so we can even number our characters' dialogue boxes, which is fun. And as a lot of you pointed out, messages sent via Morse code, or in this case telegram, were often kept short for practical reasons like time or expense. But to add more information, I think we can borrow this stamp look for some fourth wall breaking meta commentary. Back then, this extra info was added by a Western Union employee with a real rubber stamp, and for some reason usually in purple, from what I can find. I tried formatting this style of dialogue box in an exchange with a character who speaks in normal, white, round speech balloons, and I actually find it really charming with a tail added. But if you think it's still ridiculous to use a real telegram with this much detail in an actual comic, then once again I ask you to watch our business vampire video, because it shows you the design process of what I call refined reduction, where you take something like this and extract a simpler version out of it while maintaining the same charm. This is certainly a unique question. How would you make a conversation being stopped by a nose that's outside the whole thing and we can't see the person saying this? Sure, we can do that. I'm not sure why you're so interested in noses, but in order to demonstrate this, I had to ask Lydia to lend her brushwork skills to render a couple options. Then I used some retro brushes to color them like a classic detective comic. For our conversation, let's say there's two people having a quick exchange in a room. You'll have to imagine the art here, because we spent all our time on noses. They're interrupted by a sniffing noise from someone we can't see, which we'll indicate by using one of these classic stretched tails coming from out of frame. From here, we'll directly cut to our reverse shot, where we reveal the nose as he speaks his line. This is the most basic example of a shot reverse shot reveal, but we tease the reverse shot with the sniff balloon in the first panel. Now you can create a slightly different sense of pacing if you add another panel in between, where we first reveal a cropped close-up of the nose, so it feels like he's entering the frame in the foreground after making the sniffing noise. Both are completely valid ways to do a reveal, but one is more abrupt, and one gives the original two characters a beat to react to more of an ominous foreground entrance. It all depends on what style of drama you want to give your stories. I can't believe we haven't discussed this subject yet. Do you have anything for a character that teleports? This one is actually hard, not because I don't know what to do, but because there's been so many teleporting characters, and so many depictions of warps, jumps, blinks, jaunts, beam-ups, space foldings, and boom tubes. And so designing lettering for a teleporter requires a lot of sifting through past comics to find the influences that match your personal style. For me personally, the biggest influence would be Nightcrawler, as I grew up on Uncanny X-Men and Excalibur. From what I can tell, his porting ability has never really affected his lettering. Usually, he just pops out of a Banff cloud and speaks normally in a white speech balloon. I really love this panel, which shows multiple Banffs at once, with each appearance continuing the monologue. Now, I did remember the first issue of Defenders from way back in 1972, where the teleporting is depicted much more like a piece of word art. Necrodamus's words seem to fade in or out, or even look like they're being sucked into the portal with him. I think this is really cool, but if your character teleports often, it would be a lot to render. In a lot of comics and manga, the teleporter just doesn't speak out loud during jumps, probably because the creators want to limit the clutter in the panel layouts while the characters are jumping around in space. Or characters just narrate their thoughts during jumps using basic thought bubbles or narration boxes. Some people just enjoy being by themselves. But I really like this moment in Jujutsu Kaisen, which doesn't actually involve teleportation, but it is a series with a lot of concepts that warp space or move people through space and into different spaces. But I just love this particular panel with the burst pattern behind the type. It just feels like a dynamic shape that matches the feeling of jumping somewhere in a flash. So I'd like to take that energetic shape and add it to the understated technique of Nightcrawler. I'll write the first part of a character's dialogue before a jump, then add an abrupt stop in the middle of a sentence with some dashes. I'll take this extra circle here and turn it into a nice, clean, symmetrical burst shape. Then continue the rest of the sentence with an identical burst shape and a standard dialogue balloon. I really like this system because you could use this in one panel as the character blinks around quickly, or you could have a character speak as they jump across panels or even across a page turn. It's very self-explanatory of teleportation without ever being busy.